It started like any other evening in London, October 2022. The hum of activity at Heathrow Airport was filled with the usual buzz of business travelers. Among them were Victoria Chapman and Matthew Williams, well-dressed, traveling on a business-class flight to Dubai, their suitcases rolling smoothly behind them as they checked in without suspicion. There was no sign of what was hidden beneath the layers of clothes and toiletries packed inside their bags. Nothing that would raise an eyebrow. No alarms, no searches. Just two professional-looking individuals, traveling as they had countless times before. But this wasn't just another business trip. As the bags passed through the scanners, unnoticed by the agents, a silent alarm had already been triggered. The bags contained more than £10 million in cash, vacuum-sealed in bricks, wrapped carefully to avoid detection. By the time the flight landed in Dubai, Victoria and Matthew would have been living a lie for years. They weren't just two professional consultants traveling for business. They were at the center of a £500 million money laundering operation, hiding in plain sight with diplomatic immunity to shield them. The question now, how had two seemingly ordinary Londoners run one of the UK's largest money laundering networks without anyone suspecting a thing? But to understand how they lived like ambassadors while secretly running a criminal empire, you have to go back to where it all began. This is the rise and fall of two London professionals, Victoria Chapman and Matthew Williams, who ran one of the UK's most ambitious and secretive cash smuggling operations while posing as embassy employees, until their perfect plan crumbled. It was a crisp January morning in 2015, and the streets of Chelsea were lined with the remnants of last night's rain. Victoria Chapman, a 28-year-old event coordinator, and Matthew Williams, a 29-year-old tech consultant, sat at a local cafe, their laptops open but their minds focused on something else. Both were at a crossroads in their careers, ambitious but restless. They had been friends since university, where their business ideas and conversations often revolved around their shared dream of success. By 2015, they had decided to start a consultancy firm, DPL International, which was supposed to specialize in event management for diplomatic entities. Their brand was polished, sleek website, professional image, and they quickly gained a modest client base. But beneath the surface, the reality was different. Event coordination was far from as lucrative as they had hoped. "Do you think we'll ever make enough to buy a house here?" Victoria asked, sipping her coffee and glancing out at the high-rise apartments across the street. Matthew, always the more practical of the two, looked at her and shrugged. "Not with the way things are going. Maybe it's time to think bigger." They had no idea at that moment that the bigger idea would come not from hosting high-society events, but from tapping into an underground world of high-stakes financial transactions. It wasn't long before they realized the diplomatic connections they had made through their consulting firm opened doors to something much more dangerous. Money that needed to be moved across borders, cash that needed to disappear. The opportunity arose unexpectedly in mid-2015 when Victoria attended a high-profile conference at Claridge's Hotel, where a man named Rafael Cortez, a suave, well-dressed individual with a European accent, slipped her a business card. Cortez, a figure with links to organized crime in Spain and Italy, was looking for trusted professionals who could facilitate discreet travel and financial transfers under the radar. At first, Victoria hesitated. But Matthew, always eager to find a new revenue stream, saw the opportunity to make the kind of money that had once seemed out of reach. By the summer of 2015, the pair had made their first move. They started using their consultancy as a front, offering what appeared to be logistics services for diplomatic employees traveling internationally. But the reality was much darker. They began to move small amounts of cash disguised as travel expenses into and out of the UK. It was a low-risk operation, too small to attract attention, but they quickly saw the potential for much more. They began recruiting acquaintances, friends who needed extra money and could be trusted not to ask questions, to become couriers. It was a slippery slope. By late 2015, their business had shifted from legitimate consulting to full-on money laundering. The more money they moved, the more they wanted. And soon, the world of diplomatic immunity would become their perfect cover. By 2016, they would be living like ambassadors, diplomatic immunity, elite contacts, and untold amounts of money, hidden beneath the most carefully constructed lies. By early 2016, Victoria and Matthew had transitioned from small-time cash mules to orchestrating complex international financial transactions. They no longer dealt with just a few £1,000s or untraceable funds from low-level criminals. Their ambitions were far greater, and with the influx of money came new, larger risks. They were learning quickly, becoming experts in the underworld of financial logistics. Victoria sat in their office, a modest yet well-appointed space in Farringdon, filled with piles of paperwork, fake company letters and flight itineraries. She stared at a map of Europe pinned to the wall, tracing routes with a red marker. Across from her, Matthew scrolled through an encrypted chat on his laptop, looking for his next courier, a former colleague, Michael Taylor, a quiet man in his 30s who had just lost his job in construction. He was someone Matthew trusted, someone who would never question the instructions given to him. Once he's on board, we'll send him to Berlin. He'll pick up the money and bring it back through Dover. Simple, Matthew said, a plan already forming in his mind. Victoria nodded, typing up the necessary documents to make everything seem legitimate. They'd learned quickly that the key to their success was keeping everything above suspicion, using fake companies, diplomatic-looking travel passes, and booking flights in ways that looked completely normal. They knew how to move large sums without attracting attention. They learned how to beat the airport security scanners by wrapping the cash tightly, vacuum sealing it, and hiding it in everyday items like suitcases full of clothes or inside insulated cases that looked like business cargo. In April 2016, after securing a few successful runs through smaller couriers, they expanded their operations. They started recruiting people who didn't ask questions. Friends of friends, acquaintances with too much debt or personal problems to care about the risks. One of their most trusted recruits, Sarah Jennings, was a high school teacher from Hackney who had been struggling financially. Sarah was ideal because she had no prior criminal record, and her background and education made her seem like an unlikely suspect to anyone at the airport. "Sarah's the perfect candidate," Victoria remarked one evening as she arranged flight tickets and itineraries. "She'll never get a second glance in Heathrow." Matthew agreed. He handed her the flight details for Sarah's first trip. Heathrow to Dubai, business class for extra baggage allowance, and a carefully packed suitcase full of cash wrapped in layers of clothing. For the first time they were moving larger amounts, over £2 million in cash. But despite the small scale of the operation, they were growing anxious. They had become so good at their game that they began to push the limits, using larger sums of money. By mid-2017, they were regularly handling up to £10 million per trip, and couriers were traveling far more frequently. They'd perfected the system. Flights, paperwork, bags, all coordinated seamlessly. They even began using encrypted messaging apps to send last-minute updates, ensuring their couriers stayed in line with every detail. However, as they increased the scale, the risks also grew. Victoria and Matthew began to take note of some small mistakes. An odd question from a courier, a strange glance from a customs officer, but they quickly dismissed them. The system was flawless. Or so they thought. In September 2017, they made their first miscalculation. One of their couriers, Daniel Moore, was caught during a routine inspection in Barcelona. The authorities found a small package of cash tucked away in his luggage. Fortunately for Victoria and Matthew, Daniel had no knowledge of what he was truly transporting. They quickly made contact with his family and paid them to keep quiet. Daniel, panicked, agreed to go underground and disappear for a while. "Just a glitch," Matthew muttered, rubbing his temple in frustration after receiving the news. "We can't let this stop us," Victoria said. "We've come too far." But the incident left them rattled. While they had been successful in evading the authorities so far, they knew they had to refine their operations even further. They began to use more sophisticated methods, hiring legal advisors to cover up the increasingly questionable nature of their operations. They turned to offshore accounts and shell companies, further distancing themselves from the physical cash they were moving. They started becoming more connected within criminal networks, moving large sums of money for international gangs and syndicates. But even with the growing success, they couldn't shake the nagging feeling that, sooner or later, their perfect system would be exposed. By 2018 they would have moved more money than any criminal network in the UK, hundreds of millions flowing silently across borders. But one small mistake would soon put them in the crosshairs of law enforcement. And it would all unravel faster than they ever expected. By 2018 Victoria and Matthew's operation had transformed from a small-scale money laundering network into a full-fledged international syndicate. They had crossed the line and there was no turning back. They were no longer just moving cash under the guise of legitimate travel. They were now fully entrenched in a web of global financial crimes, stretching across Europe and the Middle East. The operation's expansion began in early 2018 when they received an offer they couldn't refuse from Rafael Cortez, the leader of an international gang specializing in arms trafficking and money laundering. Cortez, who operated out of Madrid, had connections to corrupt officials in several countries. He needed a reliable network to help him move his money, and he had heard of Victoria and Matthew's success with smaller operations. One evening in February 2018, Cortez flew to London for a clandestine meeting at a posh Mayfair restaurant. Matthew and Victoria, now more seasoned in their operations, greeted him with the usual professionalism, but Cortez had an air of urgency about him. "We need to scale this operation," Cortez told them, his voice low and steady, eyes darting around to ensure no one was listening. "The money's flowing, but we need a system that moves without a trace. Dubai's where the real business is." Victoria nodded. She had heard about the Dubai financial system before, its lax regulations, booming luxury markets, and lack of strict controls over the movement of funds. It was the perfect place to launder money, especially in the high-end property and gold markets. Within weeks, Victoria and Matthew had made the leap to a new level. They established a false front company in Dubai, Omnivest Gold Trading, a seemingly legitimate gold trading firm. The company's records were clean, and the paperwork was airtight, thanks to fake registration documents they acquired through a contact in Dubai's free zone. At the same time, they began expanding their courier network beyond the UK. The first major move involved Amsterdam, where Matthew and Victoria secured a reliable transport route from Heathrow to Schiphol Airport. Couriers could now use Amsterdam as a midpoint between the UK and Dubai, avoiding direct connections to the Middle East. In April 2018, they used Amir Khan, an unassuming taxi driver from East London, as their first mule to move a large sum to the Netherlands. Amir, a man with financial problems, was convinced that he was merely transporting business documents for Victoria and Matthew. As he landed in Amsterdam with over £8 million in cash packed inside insulated suitcases, he was unaware that the money was part of a larger operation involving several European syndicates. He handed off the funds to one of Cortez's men, who then traveled to Dubai. It was a flawless exchange, and it confirmed the potential of their new route. As the months passed, they streamlined the system. Couriers would fly from London to Amsterdam, where they would meet with handlers and then proceed to Dubai for the final leg of the journey. The operation became more efficient with each successful trip, and they moved increasingly larger sums of money. By December 2018, they were moving £50 million at a time, often using multiple couriers on the same flight to minimize the risk of detection. The money would then be funneled into the Dubai economy through high-end properties. They used the funds to purchase luxury real estate in Dubai's upscale areas, converting illicit money into assets that could be easily liquidated when necessary. They had perfected the art of covering their tracks: fake invoices, offshore accounts, and well-placed bribes to smooth over any obstacles. It was a well-oiled machine. However, the deeper they sank into this world, the more dangerous things became. As their operation grew, so did their exposure. While they had avoided detection in the beginning, the higher stakes meant greater scrutiny. In early 2019, Victoria and Matthew began feeling the heat. They started seeing more signs of law enforcement attention: strange calls, customs officers asking more questions, and the occasional reminder that they weren't as invisible as they had hoped. The money continued to flow, but at the back of their minds, they knew their days of quiet success were numbered. By the middle of 2019, they would have moved more than £200 million in just under a year. But as they moved more money, the risks escalated and they started making mistakes. The operation was growing too fast for even Victoria and Matthew to control. And then the cracks began to show. It was March 15, 2019, a rainy Friday morning in Dover, when the first true test of Victoria and Matthew's operation came to light. The hustle of the ferry terminal was in full swing, travelers lining up to board their ferries to France, their luggage swaying on trolleys, most oblivious to the larger web of criminal activity being quietly spun behind the scenes. Samir Ahmed, a low-level courier who had worked with Victoria and Matthew for months, was preparing for his next job. He was a driver, familiar with the quiet work of transporting cash. Samir was an unremarkable figure with a past in delivery services and a face that blended easily into the busy crowd. What most didn't know was that he was carrying over £12 million in vacuum-sealed cash, hidden in the trunk of his unmarked van. He was on his way to Calais, where a contact would take the money and route it to Dubai through the same well-rehearsed exchange Victoria and Matthew had perfected. But as Samir approached the Dover Port Customs checkpoint, things began to feel off. He had been on this route countless times and nothing had ever raised alarms. But today the officers were more attentive than usual. He could feel the eyes of the customs officers on him as he approached the security gate. "Good morning, sir." "Routine check," one officer said, waving him through, but then there was a sudden shift. The officer's demeanor turned serious. "We'll need to inspect your van." Samir, unnerved but trying to stay calm, nodded. He was instructed to pull over to the side. He had done this many times before, just a quick check and then back on his way. He assumed it would be no different today. But as the officers opened the van's back doors and began moving the bags of business documents he was carrying, their eyes widened. One of the officers immediately waved over a colleague. "Get the dog," he called out, and within moments the detection dog was on the case. The dog sniffed the bags and sat down, its trained reaction confirming what they had feared, the scent of something far more dangerous than business papers. In a matter of minutes, Samir found himself surrounded by officers, handcuffed, and escorted to a nearby interrogation room. His heart raced as he tried to keep up the pretense that he was just an innocent driver, unaware of the contents of his van. But the officers were unrelenting. In the inspection room, the discovery was confirmed, £12 million in cash. But this wasn't the first time customs had encountered something like this. The contents of the van had been well hidden, wrapped meticulously in layers of clothing and sealed tightly to avoid detection. But now, it was all laid bare. The news spread quickly back to London. Victoria and Matthew were blindsided. Samir had been one of their most trusted couriers, a reliable man who never raised suspicions. The discovery of that much cash in Dover sent shockwaves through their network. The authorities had finally caught on. Victoria and Matthew immediately sprang into action, their phones buzzing with urgent calls and messages from the network. "Get him out," Matthew barked, pacing nervously around the office in Farringdon. "Find a way to make it disappear. The money can't be traced back to us." But the more they tried to control the situation, the more it unraveled. Authorities had already linked the seized cash to a series of previous shipments, and the investigation was moving faster than they could manage. The connections between Samir's cargo and their own operations were growing clearer with each passing hour. Victoria attempted to contact Rafael Cortez to see if he could pull strings in Spain, but her calls went unanswered. The pressure mounted, and for the first time in their criminal careers, they began to feel the weight of the operation on their shoulders. This wasn't just a minor mistake, it was a full-scale exposure. Their entire network, built on secrecy and smooth operations, was now at risk of falling apart. The net was tightening. And it wasn't just Samir who had made a mistake. Victoria and Matthew were about to learn that no operation, no matter how carefully planned, could stay hidden forever. They had just made their first real misstep, and it was only a matter of time before everything would come crashing down. In the weeks following Samir Ahmed's arrest, the walls started closing in on Victoria Chapman and Matthew Williams. The authorities had launched a full-scale investigation, and the once hidden operation began to surface piece by piece, with each discovery leading closer to the masterminds behind the network. The scale of their operation was now clear. Millions of pounds moving through Europe, all linked back to DPL International, their seemingly legitimate consultancy firm. It was April 5, 2019, when Detective Inspector Karen Hayes and her team at London's National Crime Agency, NCA, received a breakthrough. The investigation into Samir's arrest had revealed several critical connections, flight patterns, courier schedules, and most damning of all, encrypted communication between couriers, handlers, and two primary figures, Victoria Chapman and Matthew Williams. At NCA headquarters in Victoria, D.I. Hayes sat with her team, reviewing a stack of documents. They had traced Samir's travel history, linking it to multiple flights and courier trips over the past 2 years. What began as a single mistake, a van loaded with £12 million, had now become a trail leading straight back to the heart of Victoria and Matthew's network. But what struck Hayes most was the evidence that Victoria and Matthew had been operating with incredible sophistication, using multiple layers of fake businesses, offshore accounts, and forged diplomatic documents to conceal their activities. "Everything leads back to DPL International," D.I. Hayes said, her voice steady but her mind racing. "They've been running this operation under the guise of legitimate business. Their couriers are traveling as diplomatic staff, using every loophole they can find." Her team had also uncovered encrypted messages sent by Victoria and Matthew, detailing the routes, the couriers, and the exact amounts of money being moved. They had discovered plans for an upcoming shipment, £15 million, which would be transported by one of Victoria's most trusted couriers, Emily Carter, a freelance translator from South London. In one chilling message Victoria had written, "Pack it tight, no room for mistakes. Emirates Flight 301 London to Dubai, May 11th. Make sure he's on the 9 a.m. flight." The authorities were now certain. This wasn't just about one or two people. This was a network, a vast international money laundering operation with its roots deeply embedded in the UK, Dubai, and across Europe. As D.I. Hayes' team pieced together the flight records, they saw something even more troubling. The couriers weren't just people like Samir or Emily, they were regular professionals with little to no criminal background, making them perfect candidates for Victoria and Matthew's operation. The team also discovered that Rafael Cortez, the Spanish arms trafficker, had been sending money through the network, making them an even larger player in international crime. At the same time, Victoria and Matthew were on edge, trying to keep their operation running despite the mounting pressure. They had taken precautions, burner phones, encrypted apps and fake IDs, but the cracks were starting to show. Victoria, pacing nervously in their office in Farringdon, could no longer keep up the facade. She had always prided herself on staying ahead of the game, but now, it seemed that their carefully constructed world was beginning to fall apart. "We've got to keep moving," Matthew said, his voice low as he stared at a map of their routes, now pinned with multiple red dots indicating previous shipments. "If we don't, they'll find us." But Victoria's confidence was starting to falter. Emily Carter, their next courier for the £15 million shipment, was set to travel in a few weeks, and they couldn't afford to let the authorities make another move. The mounting evidence against them was too much. They knew they couldn't keep this up for long. As they debated their next steps, they received an unexpected call from Rafael Cortez in Madrid. His voice was tight, a mix of concern and calculation. "They know, don't they?" Cortez asked, his tone sharp. "I've been hearing things. This is bigger than you think." Victoria paused, her heart racing. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying they're close. You need to move everything now. Don't let them trace it back to you," Cortez warned. "Get rid of the cash, the files, everything." The reality hit hard. The authorities weren't just closing in on Samir, they were connecting every dot, every courier, every drop of money, and it was all leading back to them. With the noose tightening around them, Victoria and Matthew had to make a choice: abandon everything they had built or risk it all for one final shipment. But would they be able to outrun the authorities, or was the game already up? In the early months of 2020, the world was gripped by the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. Airports were deserted, international flights were grounded, and governments imposed travel restrictions that brought global commerce to a halt. But for Victoria Chapman and Matthew Williams, this was merely an obstacle to be overcome. They quickly adapted their operation to exploit the chaos. As March 2020 unfolded, they found an unexpected opportunity. With global travel restrictions tightening, they saw a gap in the system. The demand for legitimate travel documents had increased, and governments were scrambling to maintain order. This was the perfect moment for them to continue their operations without attracting the attention they had so far managed to avoid. Victoria and Matthew realized that while most travelers were grounded, some were still able to fly. Those with official travel documents or fake certifications. They decided to exploit this loophole by manufacturing forged COVID-19 test certificates, using them to ensure their couriers could travel undetected. This wasn't just about moving cash anymore, it was about keeping the wheels of their operation running while the world locked down. By April 2020, they had set up a side hustle in full swing. Sarah Jennings, one of their most reliable couriers, was tasked with being the first to test the system. Sarah, a mild-mannered teacher from Hackney, had always been a perfect candidate. She had flown under the radar before, and now, with the pandemic making everything seem uncertain, she was the perfect candidate to move an even larger shipment of illicit cash. "I need you to go to Dubai," Victoria instructed, her voice calm despite the mounting pressure. "But this time you'll be flying under the radar. You'll have all the documents, COVID tests, quarantine papers, everything." The plan was simple. Sarah would fly from London Heathrow to Dubai via an indirect route to avoid detection. She would present a forged test certificate that declared her COVID-free, clearing her to travel. At Dubai International Airport, she would meet with one of their trusted handlers, who would take the money and exchange it for gold and other assets in the region. They were now using Dubai as their hub, the perfect location for laundering massive sums of money into the booming luxury market. Victoria and Matthew knew this was a risky move, but they had no choice. The pandemic had created a perfect storm of opportunity, and they couldn't afford to let the operation collapse now. The urgency in their voices was palpable as they discussed the logistics, running through the details of Sarah's journey. "Everything's set. Just make sure to keep a low profile. No mistakes." Sarah's first trip, scheduled for April 10, 2020, was a success. She flew out of Heathrow and into Dubai without raising any suspicion. Her COVID-19 test had been forged perfectly, and she was ushered through airport security like any other passenger. The money was safely moved once again, and Victoria and Matthew were able to breathe a little easier. But the world was watching. What Victoria and Matthew didn't know was that the authorities were also adapting to the changing landscape. Interpol, along with local law enforcement agencies, was beginning to monitor the sudden uptick in fraudulent travel documents, especially those used to bypass quarantine rules. In May 2020, an undercover Interpol agent in Dubai became suspicious of the growing network of fraudulent travel certificates circulating in the area. It wasn't long before their system began to crack. A courier named Jonathan Bell, who had been involved in transporting smaller sums for them, was flagged for using a fake COVID test on his return journey. The authorities stopped him at Dubai airport, and though he managed to evade immediate arrest, he was detained long enough to trigger an investigation into the operations of several suspected mules. As the investigation progressed, the signs began to point directly to Victoria and Matthew. Their use of forged documents became increasingly evident. The authorities had begun connecting the dots and now they were closing in. Meanwhile, Rafael Cortez, their international contact and once valuable ally, became more distant, sensing that the operation's visibility was growing too risky. He sent them a cryptic message in early June 2020. "It's time to lay low. You're making too much noise. I suggest you pause the operation. No one stays invisible forever." But Victoria and Matthew, now operating on instinct, couldn't stop. They had already crossed a line that was impossible to uncross. Their network had grown too large, the stakes too high. With every document they forged, with every trip taken, Victoria and Matthew felt the tightening grip of law enforcement. What had once been a simple way to move illicit cash had now become a web so tangled that getting out was no longer an option. The pandemic was their escape route, but it was also leading them straight into a trap they couldn't avoid. By August 2020, the walls were closing in on Victoria Chapman and Matthew Williams. What had started as a smooth-running operation, relying on forged travel documents and the chaos of the global pandemic, was now spiraling out of control. Despite their best efforts to lay low, their activities had attracted the attention of Interpol and the National Crime Agency, NCA, who had been quietly monitoring their every move. Victoria and Matthew knew the risks were higher than ever, but they couldn't afford to stop. They had an upcoming shipment scheduled, £15 million, and the pressure was mounting. Their trusted courier, Emily Carter, a quiet, reliable figure in her late 20s from South London, had been assigned to carry the cash from Heathrow to Dubai one last time. Emily had made several successful runs in the past, never asking questions, always doing what she was told. She was the perfect candidate and the system they had built around her was foolproof. Until now. As August 12, 2020 arrived, Emily was already in the air. Her flight was scheduled for a 9 a.m. Emirates departure from Heathrow to Dubai, with a layover in Istanbul. She had all the usual documents: a fake COVID-19 test, a forged business class ticket, and a bag packed with over £15 million in cash, carefully hidden beneath layers of clothes and wrapped in vacuum-sealed plastic to avoid detection. But this time things were different. What Emily didn't know was that the NCA, in collaboration with Interpol, had been tracking her every move. After months of surveillance, the authorities had gained enough intelligence to link her to Victoria and Matthew. The courier network, now stretching across several countries, had left behind a trail of digital fingerprints, encrypted messages, flight records, and bank transactions that pointed directly back to their operation. As Emily boarded her flight to Istanbul, the authorities were already in position. Detective Inspector Karen Hayes, the lead investigator, had spent weeks planning this operation, and now, it was time to execute. The NCA had a team stationed at Heathrow, Istanbul, and Dubai, ready to intercept Emily before the cash could be handed off. While Emily was in the air, Victoria and Matthew were anxiously watching her progress from their Farringdon office. They had received a message from Emily: "All set. Same as always. Let's do this." They had no reason to believe anything was amiss, but as the hours passed, the tension grew. By midday, a call came through from Rafael Cortez. "They know," Rafael said bluntly, his voice tight with concern. "I just got word. The authorities are onto you. They're tracking every move." Victoria and Matthew's hearts sank. Their world was unraveling and there was nothing they could do to stop it now. The NCA's plan was simple but effective. Emily would be intercepted before she could enter Dubai. The authorities had already sent a team to Istanbul, where Emily would have to clear customs before boarding her connecting flight. When she arrived at Istanbul airport, she was detained by Turkish authorities for a routine security check. At first they didn't find anything. But as the search continued, they flagged her for further questioning. She was escorted to a side room. In Dubai, a team of officers was ready to act, but they were waiting. They had been tracking Emily's movements for months, and now they were prepared to make the arrest the moment she touched down. The cash was almost within reach. But what Victoria and Matthew hadn't anticipated was how the authorities were closing in on them with precision. The net was tightening faster than they could react. D.I. Hayes, who had been coordinating the operation from London, sat in her office as the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Her team had connected the dots. The couriers, the fake companies, the flights, the money, it all pointed directly to the top. As Emily sat in the detention room in Istanbul, questioning her fate, Victoria and Matthew realized that the authorities weren't just after the couriers anymore. They were coming for them. They had been too bold, too confident in their ability to evade detection. The evidence was overwhelming. As Emily sat, waiting for the authorities to decide her fate, Victoria and Matthew knew the time had come. The network they had built was crumbling, and the final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. In just a few days they would face the consequences of their actions, but they had one final move to make. Would they manage to escape, or had the net finally closed around them for good? By September 2020, Victoria and Matthew had run out of options. The authorities had tracked their every move, pieced together the full scale of their operation, and the final confrontation was imminent. The network, once hidden behind layers of secrecy and forged documents, had been completely exposed. In the heart of the Ibiza nightlife, where the bright lights of the clubs flickered and the thumping bass filled the night air, Victoria and Matthew tried to blend in with the crowd. They had chosen Ibiza as their last refuge, a place to lay low, enjoy the final spoils of their illicit empire, and wait for things to cool down. They had rented a luxurious penthouse, hidden away from prying eyes, but their every move was now being watched. Victoria sat on the balcony, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She had been trying to keep her composure, but the weight of the situation was taking its toll. She knew that the authorities were closing in. Her phone buzzed with a message from Matthew. "We need to leave. They know everything." Inside the penthouse, Matthew was pacing, unable to sit still. He had heard nothing from Rafael Cortez for weeks, and the silence from their criminal contacts only heightened his anxiety. He picked up the phone and called Cortez, who had been their ally in moving vast sums of money between Dubai, Europe, and the UK. "Rafael," Matthew said, his voice urgent. "We need to move now. It's over. The NCA is all over us. They're coming for us." There was a long pause before Cortez responded. "I've been hearing things too. They're closing in. But you've got one last chance. There's an exit plan. You need to meet me at the club, Pasha, tonight. It's your only shot." Victoria looked up from her phone as Matthew relayed the message. Her heart skipped a beat. The thought of meeting Cortez in Pasha, the very place they had once celebrated their success, now felt like a trap. But there was no choice. They had burned too many bridges and their options had dwindled to nothing. At 11 p.m. that evening, Victoria and Matthew made their way to Pasha nightclub, a world-renowned venue in Ibiza known for its lavish parties and high-profile guests. But tonight, the bright lights and pounding music felt more like a countdown to their downfall. Every corner of the club seemed like a place where their past could catch up to them. They entered the VIP area where Rafael Cortez was waiting. He was alone, his usual confident demeanor replaced with a rare hint of unease. The air in the room felt thick with tension, and Victoria and Matthew could sense that this meeting was not just another deal, it was their last chance to escape. Cortez leaned forward, speaking in a low voice. "I can get you out of here, but it's going to cost you. I've got a contact who can arrange a flight out of Spain, straight to South America. You'll disappear. But you need to make a choice. Right now. Do you want to run or face the consequences?" Before Matthew could respond, the unmistakable sound of sirens filled the air. It wasn't just a single police car, it was a full-fledged raid, and it was happening right now. Victoria's heart dropped. She knew this wasn't just coincidence. The authorities had caught up with them and it was too late to escape. They'd been outmaneuvered. Through the glass of the VIP booth, they saw Detective Inspector Karen Hayes and her team entering the club, their faces focused and determined. The NCA had finally cornered them. "Time's up," Victoria whispered, the weight of the truth hitting her like a wave. D.I. Hayes made her way directly to the VIP area, her team flanking her. She had been tracking Victoria and Matthew for months, piecing together their criminal empire step by step. Now the arrest was imminent. "Victoria Chapman, Matthew Williams," D.I. Hayes said, her voice firm and clear over the noise of the club. "You're under arrest for money laundering, conspiracy to defraud, and multiple counts of illegal financial transactions. You have the right to remain silent." As the words settled in, Victoria and Matthew realized there was no way out. Their world, built on lies and illicit wealth, had collapsed. The empire they had spent years building was now in ruins, and their freedom was slipping away. But the arrest was only the beginning. The NCA had gathered enough evidence to secure convictions. Their final attempt to flee, their last hope to escape, had failed. There would be no more money to launder, no more safe houses, and no more flights to Dubai or Ibiza. As they were escorted out of the club, the flashing lights of the police cars outside illuminated the dark night, signaling the end of their criminal empire. Victoria and Matthew's world was shattered, but their story didn't end here. With the evidence stacked against them, they would soon face trial, but the web they'd woven was far from unraveled. What happens when an empire built on deception crumbles? The truth would soon come out, and it would expose much more than they ever intended. As the harsh reality of their arrest settled in, Victoria Chapman and Matthew Williams were taken from the glittering lights of Ibiza's party scene to the stark, cold walls of HMP Belmarsh in London. The luxury of their former life, the penthouses, the private jets, the stacks of cash, felt like a distant memory now, a cruel reminder of how quickly it could all come crashing down. In the quiet of their cells, Victoria and Matthew faced not just the consequences of their actions, but the wreckage they had left behind. For the first time in months, the constant pressure, the late-night flights, the adrenaline of moving millions in cash, all seemed distant, almost irrelevant. What remained were the faces of the people they had betrayed, the couriers, the handlers, even their own families, who had no idea of the darkness behind their facade. Victoria sat on the edge of the cold metal bed, her hands shaking as she looked at a photo of her son, Elliot, who was now living with her sister. He was 5 years old when she'd last seen him. She had convinced herself that all of this, the money, the power, the freedom, was for him. She had told herself that she was providing him with a future. Her mind wandered to the days when she would pick him up from school, smile at him, promise that everything would be okay. "I'm doing this for you, Elliot," she whispered softly, her voice breaking as tears welled up in her eyes. The walls around her, once a barrier against the law, now felt suffocating. The harsh reality of her actions, the lies, the deception, crushed her. She had worked so hard to keep her son safe, only to leave him without a mother for years. Matthew, sitting across from her, had his head in his hands. The weight of guilt seemed to press down on him, heavier than the handcuffs that had shackled him just days before. His thoughts were on his wife, Claire, and their 2 children, whom he had lied to for years. He had told Claire that his business trips were about consulting work, that everything was legitimate. Now the truth was out. His family would be torn apart by the lies he had fed them. "I never wanted this for them," Matthew muttered, his voice hoarse from days of silence. He had tried to convince himself that he was only trying to secure a better future for his family, but now it felt like a cruel joke. He had betrayed their trust for nothing more than greed and the illusion of success. D.I. Karen Hayes stood outside their cells, watching through the observation window, her thoughts heavy. She had been the one to track them down, to expose the carefully concealed network they had built. But there was no triumph in her expression now, just the quiet satisfaction of justice served. She knew that Victoria and Matthew had been driven by a need for something more, something bigger. She had seen it countless times before, the same hunger that drove many criminals to make reckless decisions. But this was different. Victoria and Matthew weren't hardened criminals. They weren't the violent offenders D.I. Hayes had encountered in the past. They were people who had built a house of cards thinking they could stay hidden. Now their empire had collapsed, and they were left with nothing but the consequences of their choices. As D.I. Hayes left the observation room, she paused for a moment, looking back at the 2 figures in their cells. She couldn't help but wonder, if given the chance, would they have turned back? Would they have given up everything to escape the web they had woven? But the truth was, the road they had chosen was always going to end here. The moral of this story, Karen thought, was clear: there's no such thing as an invisible crime. But as the cell doors locked and the officers turned away, Victoria and Matthew's regret would remain the only thing they could carry with them. They had the money, they had the network, but now they were left with the very thing they had tried so hard to escape: the truth. What drives someone to take such a risk? To live a life of deceit only to be caught in the end? As Victoria and Matthew faced their future behind bars, they were forced to confront not just their actions, but their reasons for making them. What would you do if you lost everything for a dream that wasn't real? The night was still young on September 13, 2020, as Victoria Chapman and Matthew Williams entered the vibrant and chaotic world of Pasha, Ibiza's legendary nightclub. The bass of the music vibrated through the floor, and the strobe lights flickered in time with the beat. It was a strange contrast, a world of flashing lights and luxury, masking the reality of their situation. This was the final place they would try to hide, the last refuge they thought they had, where they could briefly forget the ever-tightening grip of the law. Victoria, dressed in an elegant black dress, moved through the VIP area, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds. Matthew, equally sharp in a tailored suit, walked beside her, but neither of them could shake the feeling that this moment could be their last free one. It was as though the bright lights and the pulse of the music could drown out the growing panic that gnawed at them both. They hadn't heard from Rafael Cortez in weeks, and they knew it wasn't just the usual silence. Cortez had warned them that the authorities were catching up, but it felt surreal. Had they really reached the end? Or was this just another close call they'd be able to escape from? They tried to focus on the night, on the faces around them, on pretending that everything was under control. As they approached a private booth near the bar, Victoria's phone buzzed. She glanced down and saw a cryptic message from Rafael. "It's over. They're here." Her stomach dropped. Before she could process the message, she caught a flash of movement from the corner of her eye. Detective Inspector Karen Hayes entered the club, flanked by several officers in plain clothes. They were calm, but their presence was unmistakable. The last time Victoria had seen Hayes, it was through the glass of her holding cell. Now the reality hit, the NCA had found them. Hayes wasn't alone. She had a team with her, all in position to carry out the arrest. But there was no fanfare, no loud sirens. The NCA had done its homework. They knew the location, the people involved, and they were waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Victoria Chapman, Matthew Williams, D.I. Hayes's voice rang out above the music, authoritative but calm. She moved through the crowd like a shark, her eyes never leaving them. "You're under arrest for money laundering, conspiracy, and illegal financial transactions." For a split second, time seemed to stand still. Victoria and Matthew exchanged a glance, but it was too late to run. Officers surrounded them, closing in on all sides. They had no way out. The fear that had been building for months had finally materialized in the most unexpected of places. Ibiza, where they had once celebrated their empire, now the site of their downfall. Victoria felt the cold metal of handcuffs snap around her wrists as Matthew was similarly restrained. There was no escape, no clever maneuver to get out of this one. The weight of their crimes, the money they had laundered, the lies they had told, it was all coming to an end. "We've been watching you for months," D.I. Hayes continued, her voice firm, unyielding. "Every courier, every flight, every transaction, it all leads back to you." Victoria's heart raced, but she managed to maintain a calm exterior, her mind spinning with the realization that everything she had built was about to collapse. She thought of Elliot, her son, and how she had promised herself she was doing this for him. She thought of the countless hours spent on the phone with couriers, arranging flights, smoothing over deals, and how she had convinced herself this was all worth it. Now it seemed hollow. The club, once filled with the energy of music and laughter, now seemed like a distant echo. The reality of what they were facing hit hard. Not just the arrest but the long road ahead, the trials, the prison sentences, the fallout that would destroy everything they had worked for. And at that moment, with the flashing lights of the club fading into the distance as they were led away, Victoria realized that the last threads of their empire had unraveled. As they were escorted out of Pasha, the flashing lights of the police cars outside reflected off the glass walls. They passed the crowds, who were unaware of the arrests happening just steps away. The flashing lights felt like an omen, the cold reality of their capture settling in. The life they had built was gone in an instant. But what came next wasn't just about arresting two criminals, it was about dismantling an empire. And the full weight of their choices, the web of deception they had spun, was just beginning to unravel. It was a cold November morning in 2020 when Victoria Chapman and Matthew Williams finally faced the consequences of their actions. The grand, imposing halls of the Old Bailey, one of the UK's most notorious courts, were filled with tension as the pair sat in the dock. They were no longer the powerful figures who once controlled a vast network of illicit money. Now they were two individuals about to be held accountable for their crimes. D.I. Karen Hayes, who had meticulously pieced together the evidence of the £500 million laundering operation, stood in the gallery, watching as the prosecution prepared their case. She had tracked every step of the network, every flight and every false document. It had taken months of undercover surveillance, encrypted messages and witness testimonies from Samir Ahmed, Emily Carter, and several other couriers to fully understand the scope of the operation Victoria and Matthew had built. Hayes felt no sense of satisfaction in the victory, just the cold weight of the truth being laid bare. The courtroom was silent as Judge Lord Thomas entered, his robes sweeping the floor as he took his seat. The air in the room seemed to thicken as the charges were read aloud. Money laundering, conspiracy, fraud, and the illegal movement of millions of pounds in illicit funds. The evidence was undeniable. Victoria and Matthew had operated with such precision that it was clear they knew exactly what they were doing. Victoria sat with her head bowed, her mind racing. She thought of her son, Elliot, who would grow up without her. She thought of the life she had promised him, the dream she had sold herself to justify everything. But now it was all slipping away and there was no turning back. Matthew, beside her, looked exhausted. The weight of his guilt seemed to press down on him more heavily with each passing moment. He had thought that the money would bring him security, that it would be a quick fix to a life full of financial struggles. But now, as he sat in the dock, his family's future shattered by his actions, he could see how far he had fallen. The prosecutor outlined the extent of their operation. The false companies, the fake diplomatic documents, the couriers who had unknowingly moved millions of pounds for them. They had set up an elaborate network of bank accounts and shell companies to launder the money through Dubai's luxury property market and gold trade. These individuals have used their knowledge and expertise not to build legitimate careers, but to exploit weaknesses in the financial system, manipulating it for their own gain, the prosecutor said, pointing to the defendants. They didn't just move money, they built an empire of deception, a web of lies that affected not only the UK but countries across Europe and the Middle East. When it came time for the defense to speak, Victoria's lawyer attempted to paint her as a mother who had been trying to provide for her son. She was a victim of circumstance, someone who had fallen into the trap of greed but was ultimately motivated by a desire to improve her life and the life of her family. Matthew's lawyer argued that he had been a simple consultant, who had been duped into working with criminal elements, underestimating the scale of the operation. He begged for leniency, pointing to his work as a tech consultant before his involvement in the illegal network, claiming that his ambition led him astray. But the judge was not swayed by the defense's arguments. After hearing the full extent of their crimes, Judge Lord Thomas delivered his sentence. You, Victoria Chapman, and you, Matthew Williams, have orchestrated one of the most sophisticated and large-scale money laundering operations the UK has seen in recent years. Your actions have undermined the financial system, caused untold harm to innocent individuals, and you've used your knowledge and skills for exploitation, not good. The damage caused by your operation will take years to undo, Judge Thomas said, his voice echoing in the silence of the courtroom. He paused, looking at both defendants, then continued, Victoria Chapman, I sentence you to 28 years in prison. Matthew Williams, I sentence you to 26 years. You will both be held accountable for the destruction you have caused. Victoria's hands trembled as the verdict was read. Her heart sank in her chest as the reality of her life ahead set in. The dream she had built with her own hands was gone. There was no escape from the prison that awaited her. She thought of Elliot again, the child who would never understand why she wasn't there to watch him grow up. Matthew, his face pale, stared blankly ahead. He had never imagined this would be the outcome when he first took that step into the world of easy money. Now he was paying the price for the choices he had made, and the life he had promised his family would be a distant memory. In the aftermath of the sentencing, Rafael Cortez, the man who had once been their ally, faded into the shadows. The authorities had been unable to track him down, but they were certain that his role in the operation was crucial. His influence, however, was nothing compared to the wreckage left in the wake of Victoria and Matthew's downfall. The final gavel had fallen, but the echoes of their actions would resonate far beyond the courtroom. The story of how Victoria Chapman and Matthew Williams built and destroyed an empire would go down as one of the most shocking financial crimes in recent UK history. But even behind bars, they knew that their time in the spotlight was far from over. What happens when the truth finally comes to light? Will justice ever truly be served? Months had passed since the sentencing, but the ripple effects of Victoria Chapman and Matthew Williams's empire continued to reverberate through the UK and beyond. December 2020 had arrived, and the final chapter of their story was being written, not in the courts or prisons but in the minds of those who followed the case. The media, the financial institutions, and even the ordinary citizens were still grappling with the scale of the operation and the fall of two seemingly ordinary people who had orchestrated one of the largest money laundering schemes in modern UK history. In the cold winter months as Christmas approached, DI Karen Hayes stood before her team in a conference room at Scotland Yard, reflecting on the investigation that had taken over a year to unravel. The last few arrests had been made, and the final pieces of the puzzle were now in place. But the sense of justice that the team had felt when they first cracked the case was now tinged with something else. It wasn't satisfaction, It was a deep, unsettling understanding of how far-reaching and devastating these criminal networks could be. "The case is closed for now," D.I. Hayes said, her voice firm but with a note of weariness. "But the questions remain. How did we miss it? How did they hide in plain sight for so long? And how many other networks are still out there, operating undetected?" Her mind wandered to Victoria and Matthew, two people who, despite their audacity and cunning, had come undone not by force, but by their own hubris. It was an irony that neither of them had been prepared for, the overconfidence that led them to think they could outsmart a system designed to protect against people just like them. As the team filed out of the room, D.I. Hayes sat in the silence, replaying the journey that had led to this moment. They had stopped an empire, but was it truly the end? She didn't think so. Back in HMP Belmarsh, where Victoria and Matthew sat in their solitary cells, the cold truth of their convictions was sinking in. Each day felt like a repeat of the one before. There were no calls from family, no letters of support, just the constant reminder that they had lost everything. Victoria's thoughts often drifted to Elliot, her young son, who now lived with her sister. She wondered what his life would be like without her. Would he ever understand why she did it? Would he know the sacrifices she'd made? Or was she just another criminal who had hurt those she loved most? Matthew, on the other hand, sat in his cell, thinking of Claire, his wife, and their two children. He remembered how he had convinced them that he was working for their future, that everything would be fine. Now all he could do was hope they could somehow rebuild after everything had been torn apart. What would you do for money? How far would you go before the cost of your actions becomes too high? If you think this case was shocking, wait until you hear how other criminal networks operate under the radar. Drop a comment below. Do you think Victoria and Matthew's sentences were fair? Did justice go too far, or was it just right? Let us know your thoughts. We read every single comment. And if you want to dive deeper into more jaw-dropping true crime stories, hit the subscribe button and turn on your notifications. There's always another case to uncover. Tap the next video to explore the world of high-stakes crime, from hidden cartels to the masterminds behind them. The world of crime is far from simple, and the criminals who live in the shadows don't always stay there. In the next video, discover how a notorious European cartel used unsuspecting couriers to smuggle millions through one of the busiest airports in the world. Stay tuned and see you in the next story.